Joining me now is Democratic Representative from Florida, our friend Debbie Wasserman Schultz. She's a member of the House Appropriations Committee and former DNC chair. Congresswoman, I've got to get your reaction to this and what you worry about this being potential repercussions.
Well, I will tell you, as someone who represents a very large Colombian American community, that is certainly not going to make my constituents happy. Trade with Colombia here in Florida is significant, but more importantly, not only does this not do anything to reduce costs around people's kitchen table, if I were Donald Trump, the last thing that I would want to do is raise people's price of chocolate. That just seems like something that is a really bad idea. Two things that people need every day. And beyond that, Colombia is a significant trading partner with us. And I think, honestly, I don't agree with a lot of what President Petro says, but he's right when he says that Donald Trump needs to make sure that he adopts a dignified immigration policy that treats people with the dignity that they deserve, not engaging in the kind of deportation and immigration policy where he's going after people who came here legally as a higher priority than people who didn't.
Yeah. Okay. Let's get to the Trump administration's immigration crackdown, because in addition to targeting immigrants who entered illegally, Trump is also ending Biden-era humanitarian programs that allowed hundreds of thousands of migrants from Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Haiti to legally and temporarily live here in the United States. How much chaos does it create when the definition of an illegal immigrant changes?
He's shifting the sands under the feet of people who are really in a desperate situation to begin with. These are people who followed a legal process that was established for them so that we could make sure we addressed the mass border crossings and people coming to the border. By the way, people who are coming to our border crossings are also offering themselves legally and trying to be paroled into the country. Repeal of the parole program for Haiti, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela just completely ignores the fact that all of those countries have dangerous conditions that make it impossible for those people who their nationals who are in our country to return. And again, I mean, Donald Trump, I understand that immigration is a priority and border security is priority, but prioritizing people who came here through a legal pathway flies in the face of everything he said and is completely hypocritical. And it spreads law enforcement and our military far more thinly than we should be.
On to another topic. I'm curious your reaction to Trump firing 18 inspectors general overnight on Friday. I mean, that law requires the White House to inform Congress of its intentions 30 days before the IGs are removed. Senator Lindsey Graham earlier today said Trump technically violated the law. So can Congress do anything? Does it have any recourse? Can Trump's actions be undone? And then if so, for how long? I mean, 28 days that maybe remain since he did that?
I mean, the law that we tightened in 2022 was designed to specifically address a potential action like Donald Trump took on Friday night. Firing indiscriminately without notice to Congress, without justification, violates federal law and demonstrates that Donald Trump has no interest in having independent watchdogs actually review the decisions that are made in each federal agency. That's what inspectors general are for. They're to hold the administration accountable and have an independent Senate-confirmed individual who is going to objectively review those decisions. And he clearly doesn't want to have decisions he's making reviewed, and so he doesn't care whether his actions are lawful or not. He's just going to throw as much stuff up on the wall and see what sticks. But I'm sure there were going to be legal consequences. Certainly, these inspectors general can sue for their jobs. And there are other avenues as well.
Let's talk about Elon Musk, who appeared virtually at a rally on Saturday for Germany's far-right party, which he has praised before. He called to preserve German culture and said, quote, children should not be guilty of the sins of their parents, let alone their great-grandparents. Are you concerned about his role and influence in this administration?
I mean, Elon Musk's actions, you really just have to use the if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck, quacks like one, it's probably a duck. He has platformed anti-Semites, used his social media platform, which was among the largest in the world, to be able to highlight and profile and platform bigots, anti-Semites, racists, and haters. And now he's gone and made a surprise visit at the conference of the modern-day Nazi Party. He's engaged in anti-Semitic speech and actions himself. And this is who Donald Trump is pulling in as a close ally and someone who he's collaborating with. All of this, the last 6 days, have done absolutely nothing to address people's prices, the high cost of living, reducing grocery prices, dealing with people's kitchen table economic issues. Nothing, whether it's firing inspectors general, mass deportations, repealing the NIH studies, and eliminating foreign assistance in vital countries around the world. None of that does what Donald Trump promised he would do, and that is focus on bringing people's costs down.
Can I just say as an aside, I was listening to your commentary on Elon Musk, and I remind viewers that his son-in-law is Jewish, and his much-loved daughter, Ivanka, has converted to Judaism. So yeah.
He dined with, Alex, he dined with anti-Semites at his own dinner table. He pardoned anti-Semites just last Monday. Donald Trump cavorts with anti-Semites. No one should be surprised.
Debbie Wasserman Schultz, we'll see you again. Jillian, to you, because we're just getting this word in with regard to Donald Trump responding to Colombia after they turned away 2 deportation flights from the U.S. after the Colombian president revoked all flight diplomatic clearances. Donald Trump has a lot to say. What do you know about it?
Yeah, Alex, we know that the White House relies on these foreign countries to accept these deportation flights. And just moments ago, as you mentioned, I want to read, Trump took to Truth Social to criticize the Colombian government and authorities for rejecting these flights. He's now threatening emergency 25% tariffs, a travel ban, and immediate visa revocations on the Colombian government officials, visa sanctions, enhanced customs and border protection, inspections, and more. So we'll continue to see how his relationship plays out with these foreign authorities.
Yeah, I want to add the final line there. These measures are just the beginning. We will not allow the Colombian government to violate its legal obligations with regard to the acceptance and return of the criminals they forced into the United States.
Donald Trump's allies vowed a campaign of shock and awe as soon as he returned to the Oval Office. And in just a matter of days, he has already followed through on that chaotic promise. In a late-night purge, Trump fired more than a dozen inspectors general in the federal government across multiple departments. A Trump official said the move was an effort by the president to let go of parts of the Biden administration that don't align with the new administration, whatever that means. One of those fired inspectors general was Mark Lee Greenblatt, who served as the Interior Department's inspector general. Here's what he told my colleague Yamiche Alcindor just earlier today.
Well, it was a mix of emotions, frankly. It was everything from disappointment to sadness. The key question here is who does the president appoint in the place of the IGs that he's removed? We are we're so-called watchdogs inside the federal agency. So does he appoint true watchdogs or does he appoint lapdogs?
Now, the firings came hours after Trump's defense secretary nominee, former Fox Weekend host Pete Hegseth, was narrowly confirmed in the Senate after his nomination was nearly derailed by scandals, including allegations, of course, of sexual assault, which he had denied. It was only the second time in U.S. history that a vice president was required to break a tie for a cabinet-level nominee. Hegseth's confirmation was aided in part by the influential conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation, which, of course, pressured GOP senators to get him over the finish line. Trump's pick to head the Department of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, was also confirmed today in the Senate. Noem has been a vocal supporter of Trump's most hardline immigration policies, and that, of course, includes birthright citizenship, which the president has attempted to end through executive action. Just a matter of days, Trump has pumped out more than 50 executive orders, many of which seem straight out of a conservative blueprint we've long been warning about on this show, the Heritage Foundation's dystopian Project 2025. Now, according to a new analysis from Time, nearly 2/3 of the executive actions Trump has issued so far actually mirror or partially mirror proposals from the 900-page document, ranging from sweeping deregulation measures to aggressive immigration reform. Trump's order suspending the U.S. refugee admissions program, it aligns with Project 2025's recommendation for an indefinite curtailment of refugee admissions. Trump's decision to pull the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement, well, yeah, that one also follows a proposal in the conservative document that called for shutting down the agency's offices, programs, and directives designed to advance the Paris Climate Agreement. And then there was Trump's decision to reverse former President Biden's executive order that would allow transgender people to serve in the military. You see where I'm going with this? It's also in Project 2025. And this influence isn't just limited to executive orders. No. In fact, yesterday, Trump repeatedly proposed getting rid of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or as we know it, FEMA, saying disaster relief should be left up to the states while we are in the middle of multiple natural disasters. Now, Project 2025 has also called for reforming FEMA spending by shifting the majority of preparedness and response costs to states and localities instead of the federal government. 1 week in, Donald Trump isn't hiding it anymore. This is officially the Project 2025 presidency. And now that he's in the White House, he doesn't care who knows. Remember on the campaign trail, he said he'd never heard about it, didn't know anything about it? Well, now the question is, what are the Democrats going to do about it? Let's bring in my panel. Joining me now is Jennifer Horn, former New Hampshire Republican Party chair and host of the Is It Just Me or Have We All Lost Our Minds podcast, and Basil Smykel, MSNBC political analyst and professor of practice at Columbia University. It's great to have both of you with us. Jennifer, I'll start with this very troubling late-night purge last night. Let me play for you and our viewers what the Minority Leader Chuck Schumer just said about this earlier. Watch.
Donald Trump's decision to fire 12 of the federal government's independent watchdogs is a glaring sign that it's a golden age for abuse in government and even corruption. When government agencies disobey the law in the next year and there's no independent IG to keep them in check, Donald Trump could well regret this action.
Basil, why? Jennifer, give me your thoughts on that reaction first, and then I'll get Basil's thoughts on it as well. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Well, I think that Chuck Schumer made a really important point there. Probably the most important point about all of this is that these are people these are positions that serve to provide oversight as watchdogs. One of your earlier clips talked about Trump wants to install lapdogs, not watchdogs. So the folks that he's purging are kind of the eyes and ears for the American people in government, in making sure that, to oversee that whether it's corruption, waste, abuse, all of any kind. However, this shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. He's essentially he's, as always, exactly what he said he was going to do. This is the Project 2025 Donald Trump administration. And what we have seen in this insane pace of destructive executive orders over this first week, we need to brace ourselves. This is only the beginning. This is just the cornerstone of what the real corruption and destruction is going to be over the next 4 years.
So, Basil, give it to me from a Democratic strategist point of view. The question that I was posing more broadly here: what can Democrats realistically do as they see this influx of action that is beginning to effectively curtail our democracy and maybe kind of begin to break it up a little bit?
Yeah, for a period of time after the election, folks were saying that Democrats were in a bit of a malaise, which I never believed and never sort of understood. What Democrats are is looking hyper-local. There's a macro and there's a micro sort of pushback and resistance in the 2.0. The macro is a lot of what you'll see in D.C. It is Chuck Schumer speaking on it in the ways that he has. It's Democrats trying to determine, given the fact that we don't seem to have checks and balances in our system right now, what can we do in the House and the Senate to be able to at least, kind of fill those voids, plug some of those holes. So at least there's enough pushback to, so that things just don't happen sort of automatically in the way Trump wants it to. But then there's a micro. It's what happens when Democrats go hyper local. And I talk about this all the time. Most people, the policy that affects most people's lives occurs at the state and local level. If the pushback, if the resistance, if you will, is making sure that someone like Attorney General Tish James or the secretaries of state that are elected across the country, that they can stay in those seats and offer that kind of resistance, even locally, all of that really helps. But that work needs to be happening right now as we start to get into the midterms in a relatively short period of time.
Yeah,
I think it's a macro and a micro kind of approach.
I think we're at the moment, and we're already 1 week in, where we have to break the glass in case of an emergency. You know those things that you see on the train when you have the handle, and it's like you gotta start doing something. I mean, I know we're a week in, but this is exactly what Trump wanted to do, which is like flood the zone, create the chaos, and overwhelm the system in so many different ways that those who are trying to fight back are almost paralyzed, because where and when and how to fight back now becomes the challenge. Jennifer, you had the head of the Council of the Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency releasing a statement saying that the removals are a significant threat to the actual and perceived independence of IGs. Some fired watchdogs now say that anyone put in these positions in the future will automatically, no matter who it is, will be viewed as a loyalist.
Yeah, and that's extremely dangerous. And it's dangerous. Basil's talking about the micro macro level on a different, from a little different perspective. This is extremely dangerous when you look at it from the macro level, the highest level of what the impact could be. This is going to have an impact not just on individual policies in the next 2 years or 4 years. It's going to have a long-lasting impact on the trustworthiness of democracy, the trustworthiness of any elected leader going forward, Republican or Democrat. And, and we could talk about the specifics of what this means in this moment and specific policies and specific issues. But what really, I think, surprises me to a small degree with Trump and his MAGA guys is that they're so short-sighted on this. What do they think is going to happen the next time the Democrats are in charge, the next time there is a Democratic president in the White House? It's so short-sighted for them politically that I'm almost shocked, except that everything about MAGA is so short-sighted. But from the point of the American people, it is a significant threat to how our government works, the stability and the ethical running of government in our country.
Basil, you and I are old enough to remember that on the campaign trail, President Trump denied and lied about knowing anything to do with Project 2025. Time, that piece that I was referencing, the Time magazine article that I was referencing, says that 2/3 of Trump's executive actions now mirror those of Project 2025. You had a White House spokesperson responding to that article saying Trump had nothing to do with Project 2025. We knew we were being gaslit at the time that he was saying it, when we saw the people who were involved in Project 2025 just kind of hovering around the campaign. Is there anyone in this country now that has doubt that this had always been the plan?
They shouldn't have any doubt. I mean, to Jennifer's point earlier, when someone tells you who they are, believe them. And in this case, there's no reason not to believe that every aspect of that 22-page document there's intentionality around implementing it. People paid for it. They sponsored it. If you look at the document, look at all those organizations that sort of put their imprimatur on it. Now, there is a real effort to make sure that comes to fruition. And there is an important point embedded in that. The point that Donald Trump's going to throw a lot of his decision making, a lot of stuff against the wall to make people react, because kind of the chaos is the currency there, right? But then there is the other stuff that happens beneath that, the sort of submerged policymaking that might not be for public consumption, but is still going to exist. And that's why one of the ways in which Democrats can really sort of push back on this, is to keep the country really informed at the little movements, the small things. What RFPs are going out there that people are going to try to apply for to be able to do locally? What is the head of OMB doing? Like, what are the, all of those positions that we may not think of because they're not sort of sexy and don't get a lot of press, but all of those little things that government does that are submerged really need to start coming to light. That's one thing that Democrats could really do.
Breaking news on the Trump administration's plan for mass deportations in Chicago. NBC News first reporting acting Deputy Attorney General Amol Bovee is in Chicago today to actually personally observe immigration enforcement operations. DOJ released this photo of Bovee with Border Czar Tom Homan. It is not clear why Bovee is taking part. Illinois is also one of more than 20 states and cities filing lawsuits over Trump's executive order to end birthright citizenship. Protesters took to the streets of Chicago yesterday as fears of ICE raids at schools and churches take root in the city.
Any notion that would use public spaces like churches and schools, these sanctities, these sanctuaries, as a way to create political divide is not only unconscionable, but it's reprehensible.
We need to get rid of the violent criminals, but we also need to protect people, at least the residents of Illinois and all across the nation, who are just doing what we hope that immigrants will do.
Joining me now, we have Kwame Raoul, the Attorney General for the state of Illinois. Kwame, I'm so glad you're here to talk about this. First of all, can you tell us about Trump's acting Deputy Attorney General's presence there in Chicago today? What exactly is he doing on the ground there?
Well, you know what I know. It's not a surprise to me that he or others have descended upon Chicago. They made clear that Chicago and our state would be a target. I can't explain exactly what he's doing, what he plans on observing. But what I can tell you is that we have collaborated with federal law enforcement on a variety of fronts in all sorts of criminal investigations, and we will continue to do so. However, we don't partake in civil immigration enforcement. We have a trust act that prevents law enforcement, local and state law enforcement from doing so. And so there's a difference. There's a difference between criminal investigations and partaking in civil immigration enforcement.
So then two questions about that. First of all, you said you expected it. Were you given any sort of a courtesy call, told when it would happen, at least a day to expect it? Was there communication that way? And is there anything your office can do to protect immigrants? You say you have authority in place to do so, but what can you do?
Well, listen, first of all, immigration enforcement has taken place during Democrat administrations and Republican administrations. We are not in a position to interfere with appropriate immigration enforcement. That is the job of the federal government through ICE, and that will take place. And we're not going to interfere with that. What we will stand in the way of is having state and or local resources being used for civil immigration enforcement. We have a 10th Amendment that helps clarify the role of federalism in our country, the balance between the powers of the federal government and the state government. And there's longstanding Supreme Court precedents that says that the federal government cannot commandeer a state or local government to do the job of the federal government.
Okay, so you're distinguishing between criminal and civil actions. Criminal is one thing, but do you find the authorities are encroaching into civil immigration violations or troubles with their actions?
None of our law enforcement departments are interfering. Let's be clear that they may continue to partake in criminal investigations, but their job is to keep us safe from criminal acts being committed within the state of Illinois. not to do the job of civil enforcement or any other federal civil job. And that's how we should want our law enforcement to act.
Mm. And just very quickly, public safety interest, yes. But again, did you get a heads up about what was going to happen? Were you communicated with?
No, I probably find out about these things as much the same way as you do, through media reports, and which is unfortunate because I came in halfway through Trump's first administration, and we've had an incredible partnership with our law enforcement partners, including Homeland Security investigations, and we've partaken in criminal investigations, and the collaborations have been great, but there has been no such communication.
Okay. You, sir, have described yourself as a birthright baby, and your state has now sued Trump over his executive order. Is this a clear constitutional violation, or can Trump push, ultimately, the Supreme Court to reinterpret the definition of birthright citizenship?
It is very clear. We don't go into interpreting our Constitution where the plain language is clear, and conservatives have long advocated for that principle of where the language is clear. You don't go through legislative history and things what they were thinking at the time and so forth. And so the judge in Seattle was very clear that it was a blatant violation of our Constitution, that any member of the bar he's surprised that any member of the bar would try to defend such a violation.
Are you, sir, concerned that ICE is going to go into sensitive areas? The ones we've been talking about, schools, churches, hospitals, we even say playgrounds, daycare centers.
I'm hopeful that they do not do so, because it really upsets communities, and it creates something that undermines communities collaborating with one another, and it also undermines witnesses collaborating with law enforcement. They're fearful of coming forth with information that may help in solving crimes.
All right. Kwame Raoul, the Attorney General for the state of Illinois, thank you so much for your time, because I know you're very busy these days.
So I don't think everything should be a 5-alarm fire. I mean, even in the age of Trump, I don't think that. But I also think sometimes we have to spend a little bit of time delving into the most egregious things he does. On Monday, he pardoned roughly 1,500 people convicted for their actions on January 6th, including 600 who engaged in violence. And he also commuted the sentences of 14 others. So that means all of them, even the most violent of the insurrectionists, are free. It means someone like David Dempsey, who prosecutors called political violence personified, who attacked officers with flagpoles, crutches, pepper spray, broken furniture, and his own hands and feet, is free. So is Daniel Rodriguez, who drove a stun gun into the neck of Officer Michael Fanone. So is Christopher Coughlin, who screamed at, pushed, punched, swatted, slapped, and choked police officers. And so is Andrew Taki, who assaulted officers with bear spray and a metal whip. Now, in pardoning these people and hundreds more like them, Trump sent a pretty clear message that there are no consequences, that if you commit a crime in his name, no matter how violent, it's not a crime, that political violence is okay. And that's exactly the message some of the worst offenders seem to have received loud and clear. I mean, just listen to former Proud Boys leader Enrique Tarrio.
We went through hell, and I'm going to tell you, it was worth it, because what we stood for and what those guys stood for was what we've been fighting for and what we saw yesterday on the inauguration stage. Now it's our turn. Now it's our turn. I'm happy that the president's focusing not on retribution and focusing on success, but I will tell you that I'm not going to play by those rules. The people who did this, they need to feel the heat.
I'm not going to play by those rules. It's pretty chilling. Listen to what Oath Keepers founder Stewart Rhodes said in the halls of the Capitol, no less.
I didn't enter the Capitol. I didn't strike a police officer. None of my guys did either. We were railroaded for political purposes because of who we were, because of our identity, because we're oath keepers. That's why we were prosecuted for seditious conspiracy. We didn't hatch a plan. There was no plot to invade the Capitol. We didn't bring any weapons. It's just all kabuki theater to justify trying to prevent President Trump from being able to run again under the 14th Amendment.
It's quite a revisionist statement of history there. No remorse, no regrets. Instead, it's just revenge and retribution. And listen to what some pardoned January 6 rioters and their families told my colleague Alex Wagner this week.
If Trump comes out and says this is an issue that, you know, I need you guys to come out for me. I need you guys to show up for me. It may mean taking to the streets. Do you think that the people who just served, you know, years or months or weeks in prison would do that again for him?
I can't speak for everybody, but I can speak for myself, and the answer to that question would be yes. Since he's not going to quit on the American people, I have no absolute right to quit on him, so I would show up.
Do you think now that he's pardoned everybody, he can count on this group of people again?
Oh, absolutely. I would die for the man.
No signs of stopping, which is, of course, chilling. But why would they stop? When this was the response to the pardons from far too many Republicans in Congress just this week.
The president's made a decision. We move forward. There are better days ahead of us. That's what we're excited about. We're not looking backwards. We're looking forward.
What about those who assaulted police officers and then were pardoned by the president?
I haven't seen any. I haven't gone into the detail.
What are your specific thoughts about President Trump's pardon?
It's his authority, and he's using it. We're looking forward and beyond.
We're looking forward the next 4 years, not the last 4.
You put forward with some of those pardons for violent offenders. Are you comfortable with that?
I haven't seen the details, but I think a lot of those pardons are definitely well deserved.
I think the gift is that it's all behind us now. We can stop talking about it.
This was literally an attack on the building they all work in, put them and many of their staff at risk. What you just heard there is what I would call obedience in advance. And it is not just happening in Congress, as you just saw, but also among private sector leaders and also, yes, even in the media. And if you're wondering how any society gets to a place where people don't speak out, where leaders are incentivized to continue suppressing rights and freedom of speech, this is how. Politicians refusing to speak out about something that is so completely indefensible, behaving like these actions are completely normal. Let's just all move forward. And they're refusing to speak out because they're afraid of Donald Trump. They're afraid for their own political futures. But this shouldn't even really be a political question at all. It's actually a moral question. It's about the very real, very scary prospect of political violence in the future, about the fear and the threat about what comes next, which even Lindsey Graham acknowledged this morning.
I fear that you will get more violence. Pardoning the people who went into the Capitol and beat up a police officer violently, I think was a mistake because it seems to suggest that's an okay thing to do.
Of course it suggests it's an okay thing to do. Not only are these insurrectionists free, but they are emboldened, and they clearly feel empowered. Just listen to them. See, if the lesson here is you can commit acts of violence in the name of Donald Trump and you'll get away with it, even be celebrated because of it, what's to stop anyone from doing this again in the future? Someone who unfortunately knows too much about the impacts of political violence is my next guest, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. She was the target of a kidnapping plot back in 2020 during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, and she described what that was like in her new book, targeted for young adults, True Gretch. Here's what she said, quote, "I genuinely wanted to understand how people had gotten angry enough to actually want to kill me. But for the moment, I needed to focus not on the feelings of those who would harm me, but on my family." She goes on to say, "We carried on with our lives, trying not to think about whatever threats might be looming outside our four walls. Meanwhile, the plotters were becoming more brazen. In July, the men began training to storm a house and capture people inside. They built a replica, calling it a kill house, and practiced taking hostages. That same month, one was recorded saying, 'Snatch and grab, man, grab the effing governor.'" Whitmer goes on to say, nearly 3 years down the road, "There's no doubt that the apparent kidnapping and murder plot changed me. I've always loved meeting people and mingling in big groups. But now when I walk into a party or event, I find myself scanning the room. I look for anything that seems off and take notes where the doors are. It's not that I live in fear, but there's a heightened awareness now that I didn't have before. Not just as governor, but as a person, as a mom, and as a wife." Joining me now is Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, a new young adult edition of her book, True Gretch, which I just read last week. It's so good. It's targeted for kids over 14 and older, I will tell you. It comes out on Tuesday. I have so much I want to talk to you about the book, so much that struck me that I identified with. I just want to start where I ended there, because there are very few people, fortunately, but unfortunately for you, who have been through and experienced the fear of political violence. And you speak about it with such a rawness in your book. And I just wanted to ask you, I mean, with the news this week, I just gave my take on it, but do you fear this incentivizes some of these people to act again? How do you view it?
I am concerned that everything that's happening continues to normalize violence against people who are political opponents, people who disagree with you. You know, whether the violence is targeted toward me, a Democratic governor, or it is targeted toward Nancy Pelosi's husband or Donald Trump himself when he was on the stage in Pennsylvania, we have to call it out. We cannot let this become normal. And so I am concerned about it. And the book is geared toward talking to young people because we want to make sure that young people don't see this and live through this and think that this is normal and okay, because it's not.
That's one of the things I loved about the book. You tell so many good stories. You clearly don't like bullies. I also don't like bullies. And I want to get to that. I want to ask you one more thing, because Trump also pardoned 8 people accused in federal court in your home state of Michigan of blocking access to abortion clinics. You have been one of the most outspoken governors about protecting women's rights. What's your reaction to that? And what is the message that you want women in your state to hear as they see that news?
Well, not only have I been outspoken, but the people of Michigan have been outspoken on this when we amended our Constitution to protect this right. And so as governor, my job is to make sure that everyone has access and that people are held accountable. If you try to get in the way of someone else exercising their constitutional rights, you're in the wrong. And so I do think that our efforts to make it easier for women to access everything from contraception to the ability to get an abortion is something that I'll continue to fight for and erect barriers to protect people who do.
I'm sure many, many people are happy to hear that. And as you said, the people of Michigan have spoken. One of the things, as I mentioned, you kind of have lots of tactics for people to approach bullies. That's one of my themes that I took away from your book. One of the things that you talk about is the threat to withhold resources that you were experiencing and you had to fight back against to defend the people of Michigan, stand up for the people of Michigan during the height of COVID. We're a week into the Trump administration. We're seeing this a bit with funding for wildfires in California. There are going to be crises we deal with that you deal with as governor. Do you have any advice for Governor Newsom or for other governors who are going to have to navigate this?
My colleagues don't need my advice, but what I will say is this. You know, whether it is dealing with a bully when you're in second grade or in college or in adulthood, these are muscles that unfortunately we'll have to use throughout our lives. And so telling young people about things that happened to me, whether it was a nickname that I got when I was in elementary school or one that my dad gave me because I'm so klutzy and I knocked out my front teeth, and my nickname around the house is Gravity Gretchen. It is important to not let someone else define you, but to own your space, to define yourself. And sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to take their sword and make it your shield. When I was called that woman from Michigan, we leaned into it. And people, the Etsy community started making swag with that woman from Michigan. And to this day, you could still buy it. But I think it's because we were able to say, okay, someone else isn't going to define me. I'm going to define me. And that's a lesson I hope young people take from this book, and adults of all ages, too.
One of the issues I know you've been speaking out about, and I know you're thinking about in this regard, is this threat of tariffs. And it sounds sometimes like an obscure issue to people, you know, like a tax. What does it even mean to me? But you've been talking about it in a very clear way in terms of how it would impact people in Michigan. What concerns you the most? What might people not understand, and what are you prepared to do about it?
Well, I'll start with this. You know, I am not opposed to all tariffs per se. They can serve an important purpose. Treating all of these countries, China, like Canada and Mexico, could have a real huge negative impact on the Michigan economy as well as the U.S. economy. Jobs, drive up the cost of goods, drive up the cost of energy and housing. And so that's why I'm glad to see the Trump administration moving slowly on this front, being hopefully, looking at this with like a scalpel as opposed to a sledgehammer, because when you say no to Canada, it means you're saying yes to China. And I know that's not what they want to do here. And they don't want to drive up costs for consumers. So we cannot lose sight of the fact that our North American neighbors are crucial to our economy. And while I understand that there's needs perhaps to be some negotiation on international agreements, tariffs could have a huge impact that would kill jobs, make things more expensive for consumers, and hurt the Michigan and the U.S. economy.